Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Albert Clark, so I head up our offshore wind team at Department for International Trade. We've also got Barnaby Toll with us here from UK government, so he's head of renewables, investment and infrastructure. So I've just got a short 5-minute presentation to kind of run through our current thinking for offshore wind, particularly floating offshore wind for our strategy, and then I was hoping to do a few questions at the end, but if not, we can just catch up with anyone in the networking lunch. So a lot of this has already been covered already, so we're obviously one of the world leaders for floating offshore wind, and there's a real push from central government, particularly number 10 now, to really move towards floating offshore wind, as we've had quite a lot of domestic success in fixed bottom. So obviously we had some of the world's first floating offshore wind farms and the world's largest, and our 1 gigawatt floating target by 2030 has already been flagged through several of the presentations, and just to flag that is inclusive of our 40 gigawatt target. There's obviously the 100 gigawatt by 2050 Climate Change Committee target as well, and it's kind of UK government's estimate that around 50% of that capacity could come from floating. So the market there is huge, and I'll touch on this in a bit more detail later, but we've obviously announced £160 million for floating offshore wind manufacturing and infrastructure as well in the most recent comprehensive spending review. So I mean, a lot of this has been said here, but the technology is proven, so we really need to drive down the cost and scale now. So from a UK government perspective, what we're really doing now for floating offshore wind is looking to learn from the lessons of fixed bottom. So the key point here really is future-proofing. There's a few kind of famous examples of blade manufacturing facilities across the UK who can't really build the latest scale of blades. So what we want to do if we're attracting investment or securing any sort of development in the sector is making sure that we're taking into account this kind of rapid innovation and scale of deployment that can happen. I mean, the scale has already been flagged, but the Dogger Bank wind farm at 3.6 gigawatts is around the size of Greater London, and the turbines at the moment are kind of 2/3 the size of the Shard. So we really need to make sure our manufacturing capability can meet these demands. Innovation, so the Floating Offshore Wind Innovation scheme was kind of noted earlier, so that's funded up to 11 projects, and it's up to £60 million worth of UK government funding. Infrastructure is key, so this has been touched on quite a lot already. We launched the OMIS, so the Offshore Wind Manufacturing Investment Support Scheme. It's a bit of a mouthful, so we probably won't do one as complex in the future, but the infrastructure requirements for that were really to address the kind of market failures that we had in fixed bottom offshore wind. So we announced 2 ports through that kind of program, so there was one on the Humber, and there's one on Teesside as well. And after we kind of announced our infrastructure improvements, we managed to secure a lot of inward investment to those sites. So we'll be looking to do the same for floating offshore wind as we progress. So we're aware that we probably don't have the correct infrastructure in the UK, and that's across the whole of the UK. None of our ports are currently fit for purpose. So we're really looking to engage with industry as much as we can at the moment to understand what we should be targeting for floating offshore wind. Overcoming the chicken and egg problems. So this is a big issue we've had in UK government over the past few years of developers refuse to use a manufacturer until they have a site in the UK, and a manufacturer refuses to get a site in the UK until they have an order from developers. So what we're really looking to do is engage as much as we can to see what policy levers we can put in place to try and alleviate this issue. We want to see as many framework agreements as we can from the big developers on manufacturers from the tier 1 all the way through into the tier 2 plus. So we've done policy measures like supply chain plans, but we're looking to go further where we can, and we'd really welcome views on how to deliver this. And of course, just a tailored strategy and understanding our limitations. So potentially we know we might not be able to be competitive for full-scale fabrication of floating foundations, but are there kind of other areas across the supply chain that we can target moving forward? So what are we currently doing to unlock the opportunity? And I know everyone in this room will probably say we can be doing more, but as I've mentioned, we obviously announced £160 million for floating offshore wind manufacturing and ports. So it's a separate £160 million pot from the Offshore Wind Fixed Bottom Fund. I feel like they should have probably given us 161 or something, because they often get confused. So we'll be kind of engaging with industry over the next year to really understand how we should spend that funding. We've obviously got an ambitious commitment to floating deployment, and a lot of you will have seen, if you have keen eyes, that the new kind of energy strategy is expected from UK government over the next few weeks, I'd imagine. We know as much as you, really. It's being kept very close to number 10's chest, but all the kind of press articles that the PM has been doing around those have really been stating that we need to up our renewables deployment, and we'll need a lot in floating offshore wind. So I'd be surprised if kind of our targets weren't made more ambitious, but as I said, we're kind of waiting to see what's delivered from that as with you. We've obviously reformed our supply chain plan policies, so this is one of the mechanisms that you have to do if you're over 300 megawatts for fixed bottom offshore wind, applying to the contract for difference. we've now made it include floating offshore wind for kind of projects below 300 megawatts as well. So we knew that we didn't understand the fixed bottom supply chain quickly enough, so we're really looking to do this for floating offshore wind at the moment as well. We've obviously got a wide range of programs, so the Offshore Transmission Network Review has been mentioned a few times, so that's one of our key things to improve grid deployment rates, and obviously we're looking into areas around lease deployment as well to really ensure that we can rapidly increase our deployment rates. Annual auctions have been announced as well for the contract for difference, so they used to be biannual, so we're looking to kind of do this and give investors as much foresight and security of pipeline as they can get to ensure we can secure investment, but also our deployment rates don't falter. And obviously close collaboration with industry. That's why Barnaby and I are here today, so we're really keen to speak to as many of you as we can today. So I'm not sure if everyone can see that slide, but this is kind of what we did for fixed bottom offshore wind. So we announced some strategic priorities for fixed bottom offshore wind working with the Offshore Wind Industry Council. So we announced 4 strategic priorities in blades, monopiles, cables and towers. And through that, we announced kind of 7 FDIs over the past 18 months, which is around £1.6 billion worth of private sector investment, if you include the 2 ports, and up to 4,100 jobs for the UK. So the kind of potential for offshore wind is there. You'll kind of notice on some of the targets, we don't have like jacket manufacturing as a target. That's simply because we don't believe we could be cost competitive with the East at this point. So we're looking to do the same thing for floating offshore wind. And I'll talk a bit more on the next slide about this. So there's kind of key things to look out for in 2022 from UK government. So I'll kind of just leave that on the screen, but what we're also doing in kind of due course and hopefully as soon as possible is we're requesting as much information as we can get from industry, and it will be a formal process that we'll share with kind of all the devolved administrations and all our networks of clusters and trade associations to understand how government should be spending our £160 million for floating offshore wind manufacturing and ports. And as part of that, we'll be looking to kind of establish the new strategic priorities for floating offshore wind manufacturing. So it may be that we can be more cost competitive in the tier 2+, so do we need to be targeting anchor systems or mooring systems? So it's very much more an open door policy than it was before, just due to timing, so we're looking to engage as much as possible. But that's it from me. I don't know if anyone has any questions to ask us. If not, please just come and speak to me and Barnaby during the networking lunch.